I used to think about the Cowdens every Labor Day weekend, not because I knew them, I didn't, but because my grandmother did, and because she made sure I understood what happened to them before she let me go camping in those mountains. My name's Aaron. I grew up in Medford, about 40 miles from where it happened. My grandmother worked at the general store in Copper back in 1974. She was there that Sunday morning when Richard Cowden walked in with his little boy to buy milk. But he told my mom once that the way they were hidden it wasn't random. Whoever did it knew the area, knew where to put them so they wouldn't be found by accident. I asked what she meant. The cave wasn't visible from any trail. You had to know it was there, and the rocks in front of the entrance, they were placed carefully, stacked, like someone was trying to preserve something. That word stuck with me. Preserve. Emma said her uncle mentioned something else. Something that didn't make it into the official reports. There were tracks around the cave, boot prints. But they were old, he said, older than the bodies. Like someone had been going there for a while before. I asked if they ever figured out who. She shook her head. They had a suspect, a guy named Wayne Lee Little. He'd killed someone before and got paroled a few months before the Cowdens disappeared. He was in Copper that weekend. He even had a .22, the same kind of gun they were shot with. But they never charged him? No, not enough evidence, I guess. He died in prison years later for something else. We didn't talk about it again after that night, but I kept thinking about it. About the tracks. About the cave. I started researching on my own. I found old newspaper articles, police reports that had been digitized. Most of it was what I already knew, but then I found something in a scanned archive from a local paper in 1975. It was a small article published a week after the bodies were found. It mentioned that authorities had interviewed several people who were camping in the area that weekend. One of them, a man named Gerald Pritchard, told police he saw a family matching the Cowdens' description on the trail Sunday morning around 10 or 11. He said they looked fine, happy. But he also said he saw someone else, a man, alone, walking about 50 yards behind them on the same trail. Pritchard couldn't describe the man. He said he wasn't close enough. But he remembered thinking it was strange because the man didn't have any camping gear, just a rifle. The article didn't say anything else about it. No follow-up, no clarification. I tried to find more, but there was nothing. Either it wasn't considered important or it led nowhere. I told Emma about it one night. She got quiet. What? I said. My uncle said something like that. He said when they found Richard tied to the tree, the rope was tight. Like he'd been tied up and left there for a while before he died, so he would have seen whoever did it. He would have known. I didn't know what to say. She kept going. And the kids, they were in the cave with Belinda. Hidden, but they didn't try to hide Richard. They left him out in the open, tied up, visible, like they wanted him found eventually. But not the others. I thought about that for a long time. A few months later, I drove down to Medford to visit my grandmother. She was in her 80s by then, still living in the same house. I asked her if she remembered anything else about that day. The day Richard and David came into the store, she thought for a while. There was one thing, she said. I didn't think about it until later, but when they left, Richard looked back at me. Through the window, I was cleaning the counter, and I looked up, and he was standing outside just looking in. Why? I knew known. I thought maybe he forgot something, but then he just turned and walked away. David was ahead of him, already heading up the trail. She stopped. I think about that sometimes. That look, like he was making sure I saw him. I asked what she meant. I don't know. Maybe nothing. But it's the only thing I can't explain. I don't go camping in the Siskiyous anymore. Not because I'm afraid. It's just that the area doesn't feel the same to me. The last time I went, a few years ago, I drove up to Applegate Lake. I parked near where the old campground would have been, back before the water. I walked down to the shore and looked out over the lake. Somewhere under there is the general store, the trail, the place where they set up their tent that weekend. And somewhere up in the mountains behind me, 7 miles into the wilderness, is a cave. I stood there for a while, thinking about the milk on the table, about Richard's last look through the store window, about the man with the rifle walking 50 yards behind them on the trail. And I thought about the one thing my grandmother said that I've never been able to forget. They never found all of the money in Richard's wallet. He had almost $200 when they left for camping. When they found the wallet at the campsite, there was only $60 left. I never asked her why that mattered. She told me the story when I was 16, right before my first camping trip to the Cascayos with friends. There was nothing unusual about them, she said. We were sitting on her porch. She had this way of staring past you when she talked about it, like she was watching it happen again. Richard seemed like any other father. The boy David was holding his dad's hand. They were smiling. She paused for a long time. I rang up the mill. But now I think I know. Someone went back to the camp after. Someone took the money. Someone wanted them to know that whatever happened wasn't random. That someone had been there. Close enough to take something. Close enough to leave the rest. I got back in the car and drove home. I haven't been back since. But sometimes, late at night, I think about the camp. About the keys on the table and the milk going warm in the sun. And I think about the exact moment when they realized someone else was there. Richard paid. They walked out together. And that was it. I asked her what she meant. That was the last time anyone saw them alive. The way she said it wasn't dramatic. It was flat. Factual. That's what made it stick. She told me the rest slowly. How the family didn't show up for dinner that night. How Belinda's mother drove to the campsite and found everything still there. The truck, the keys, the purse, the milk Richard had just bought that morning sitting on the picnic table in the sun. How the baby's diaper bag was untouched. How their dog came back alone the next day, scratching at the store's door. They searched for months, she said. Helicopters, hundreds of people. They didn't find anything. I remember asking if they ever figured out what happened. She looked at me then, really looked at me. They found them 7 months later, up in the mountains. Richard was tied to a tree. She didn't say anything else for a while. I didn't ask. Eventually, she told me the rest. How the wife and kids were hidden in a cave. How someone had stacked rocks in front of the entrance to hide them. How they'd been shot. How the baby had been. She stopped herself. Just don't go anywhere alone, she said. And if something feels wrong, you leave. You don't wait to figure out why. I went on that camping trip. We stayed near Applegate Lake, which didn't exist back when the Cowdens disappeared. The dam flooded copper in 1980. The whole town is underwater now. The general store, the campground, all of it. I didn't think much about the story while we were there. We had a good time. Normal teenage stuff, but on the last night, after everyone else had gone to sleep, I stayed up by the fire. The woods were quiet, not silent. There were sounds, the kind you expect, but they felt distant, contained. I started thinking about what my grandmother had said, about how they just vanished in the middle of the day, about how Richard and David walked back from the store and never made it to the campsite, even though it was less than a mile away. I thought about Belinda and the baby, waiting, not knowing, and I thought about the detail that bothered me most. The milk was still on the table. The carton Richard bought that morning, which meant they made it back to camp. They set the milk down, and then something happened fast enough that they couldn't grab the keys, couldn't grab the purse, couldn't grab anything fast enough that nobody nearby heard a sound. I put out the fire and went to the tent. I didn't sleep much. Years later, I moved to Portland for work. I didn't think about the Cowdens for a long time. But then I started dating someone who grew up in Jacksonville, just outside Medford. Her name was Emma. One night, we were talking about where we grew up, and she mentioned copper. My mom's family had property near there before the dam, she said. There's this whole story about a family that disappeared. It's kind of a local legend. I told her I knew about it. She looked surprised. Most people outside the area don't. We started talking about the case. She knew details I didn't. She said her uncle had been part of the search party in 1975, the one that found the bodies. He doesn't talk about it much, she said. I worked at a sporting goods store in Tacoma from 1984 to 1987. I don't work there anymore, and I don't live in Washington. But I still remember the way people started looking at each other after the second couple disappeared. The way conversations would stop when someone walked into a room. The way everyone suddenly became aware of how many strangers passed through town every single day. My name's Vincent. I was 23 when it started. The first time I heard about Stephen Harkins and Ruth Cooper was at work. Mineral, the same area where Stephen and Ruth had been found. Is she dead? Stabbed? And Vincent. He stopped. What? She had a sock around her neck. Same kind. White tube sock with blue rings. I felt my stomach drop. It's the same person, I said. Yeah, that's what everyone's thinking. They found Mike's truck nearby. The driver's seat was covered in blood. But Mike was gone. At first, the police thought maybe Mike had done it. He had a history. There'd been a domestic incident a couple months before Diana disappeared. Some people thought maybe he killed Ruth and Stephen too, for reasons nobody understood, and then killed Diana and ran. But that didn't make sense. If Mike killed everyone, who drove his truck to Spanaway and dropped off Crystal? Who made sure a 2-year-old was safe? The story started getting more attention. News stations from Seattle came down to cover it. They called it the Tube Sock Murders. People started coming up with theories. Some thought it was a trucker who picked up hitchhikers. Others thought it was someone local, someone knew the area around Mineral. The police wouldn't say much, just that they were investigating connections between the cases. At the store, we started selling out of certain items: locks, bear spray, hunting knives. People were scared, but they didn't talk about it directly. They'd come in, buy what they needed, and leave quickly. One afternoon in March, a guy came into the store looking for camping gear. He was maybe in his 30s, average height, wearing a Carhartt jacket. Normal. He asked about tents that would hold up in cold weather. I showed him a few options. He didn't say much, just nodded and looked them over. Then he asked, "You ever go camping up near Mineral?" I said no. "Good," he said. "I used to." "Not anymore." He bought the tent and left. I stood there for a long time after, thinking about the way he said it. Not scared, not angry, just matter of fact, like he'd made a decision and didn't need to explain it. Weeks went by, then months. The story faded from the news. Police said the investigation was ongoing, but there were no updates, no arrests. People stopped talking about it as much, but you could tell it was still there, in the back of everyone's mind, the knowledge that someone had done this and never been caught. I thought about it constantly. I couldn't let it go. I started going to the library on my days off, reading old newspaper articles, trying to piece things together. I didn't know what I was looking for. I just felt like there had to be something everyone was missing. One thing kept bothering me: the socks. Why would someone use a tube sock as a ligature but not actually strangle the victims with it? Both women had been shot. The socks were tied around their necks after they were already dead. It wasn't functional. It was symbolic, a signature. I found an article from February 1986 that mentioned police had tested the sock found on Diana. They were looking for DNA, fibers, anything that could identify the killer. But the article said the sock was generic, the kind you could buy at any department store in America. Thousands of people owned socks exactly like it. I thought about that for a long time. In April of 1986, I was working the register when an older woman came in. She was buying a fishing rod for her husband. We made small talk while I rang her up. She mentioned she lived near Eatonville, just outside the area where Mike's trap lines were. "It's been quiet since winter," she said, "but people are still nervous. My husband won't go out to check his traps alone anymore." I asked if he used to. "All the time. For 30 years. But after what happened to that reamer fellow," she shook her head. "He won't go out there unless someone's with him." "Did he know Mike?" "Not personally, but he saw him around. Said he was a decent guy." Kept to himself mostly. She paused, like she was deciding whether to say something. My husband said something about him that stuck with me. He said Mike was the kind of guy who wouldn't go down easy. Big guy. Strong. If someone attacked him, there would have been a fight. Maybe there was, I said. Then where's the body? I didn't have an answer. She paid and left. I kept thinking about what she said, about Mike being strong, about there being a fight. And I thought about the blood in the truck. Over the next year, I'd occasionally see articles about the case. Police were still investigating. They'd get tips, follow leads, but nothing went anywhere. In 1987, I left the sporting goods store and took a job in Seattle. I needed a change. The whole thing, the murders, the fear, the not knowing it had gotten to me more than I wanted to admit. I stopped following the case. It was mid-August, 1985. My manager, Dale, came in looking tired. He was the kind of guy who always had the radio on, always knew what was happening around town. That morning, he turned the radio off. They found that couple, he said. I didn't know what he was talking about. The teachers. From the vocational school. They went camping up near Mineral a week ago and didn't come back. He told me they'd found the boyfriend shot in his sleeping bag. I tried to forget about it, but every now and then something would remind me. A news segment, a podcast, someone mentioning Mineral. And I'd think about those tube socks, about the person who tied them carefully around the necks of two women who were already dead. What kind of person does that? Not someone in a rage, not someone panicking, someone calm, someone who had time. Years passed. I moved to Oregon, got married, started a family. Then, in 2011, I was reading the news online and saw a headline. Remains found near Mineral identified as missing man from 1985. I clicked on it. Hikers had found a partial skull in the same area where Diana's body was discovered 26 years earlier. Forensic analysis confirmed it was Mike Reamer. He'd been dead the whole time, which meant he wasn't the killer, which meant everything people have theorized for decades. All the speculation about Mike having enemies, about him killing Diana and running all of it was wrong. There was someone else, someone who killed 4 people in 4 months. Someone who was never caught. I sat at my desk for a long time staring at the article. The thing that bothered me most wasn't that the killer was never found. It was the little girl, Crystal. Someone murdered her parents, drove her 30 miles, and left her where she'd be found safe. Why? I thought about that for days, weeks. And then I realized something. Whoever did it knew she was too young to identify them, too young to describe what happened, too young to be a threat. But they didn't hurt her. They could have, easily, but they didn't. They made sure she survived. I don't know what that means. I don't know if it makes the person more or less terrifying. All I know is that someone out there, someone who tied tube socks around the necks of 2 women, someone who killed 4 people and left no evidence, someone who might still be alive decided that a 2-year-old's life was worth sparing. And I'll never understand why. I don't live in Washington anymore. Haven't for years. But sometimes, late at night, I think about Mineral. About those logging roads. About how quiet the woods must have been when it happened. And I think about the person who did it, walking back to their truck, putting the sock in their pocket for next time. Because that's the thing I can't shake. They kept one. The girlfriend was missing. The dog was dead too. I remember thinking it sounded like a robbery gone wrong. Something random, bad luck. Dale shook his head. They left everything. Wallet, car keys, all of it. Whoever did it didn't take anything. That detail stuck with me, but I didn't think much about it. Tacoma wasn't a small town. Things happened. You heard about them, you felt bad for a day or two, and then you moved on. A couple of months later, Dale came in with that same look. They found her, he said. The girlfriend. It was late October by then. I'd almost forgotten about it. Where? Hearts Lake. About a mile from where they found him. He didn't say anything else right away. He just stood there staring at the register. "What?" I said. She had something tied around her neck, like a ligature, but it wasn't rope. What was it? A sock. A tube sock. I didn't know what to say. It sounded bizarre, almost absurd. "Why would someone do that?" I asked. Dale looked at me. "I don't know." But it wasn't why she died. They said she was shot, so why the sock? He shrugged. "That's what everyone's asking." For the next few weeks, people talked about it. The story made the local news. Police said they were investigating but didn't have any suspects. Some people thought it was a random attack. Others thought maybe the boyfriend had enemies, someone with a grudge. I didn't have an opinion. I just thought it was sad. Then December came. It was a Thursday. I remember because Thursdays were slow and I was working alone that afternoon. Dale came in around 4, earlier than usual. He didn't say anything at first, just stood by the counter, staring out the window. "They found a little girl," he said finally. I looked up. Outside a Kmart in Spanaway, 2 years old, just standing there in the parking lot. Alone. Where are her parents? Gone. They went out to check trap lines yesterday and never came home. The girl was just left there. Someone dropped her off. I felt something cold settle in my chest. Who drops off a kid at a Kmart? Dale didn't answer. Over the next few days, more details came out. The missing man's name was Mike Reamer. His girlfriend was Diana Robertson. They'd taken their daughter with them to check his trap lines along the Nisqually River and cut down a Christmas tree. The little girl, Crystal, kept saying the same thing when they found her. Mommy was in the trees. Nobody knew what it meant. Police searched the area where Mike usually set his traps. They didn't find anything. His red Plymouth truck was missing. The family had just vanished. I started paying more attention to the news after that. I couldn't help it. Something about the little girl being left at the Kmart felt wrong in a way I couldn't articulate. It wasn't just cruel, it was deliberate. Someone had driven her 30 miles from the trapline area. Someone had made sure she was found safe. Why? 2 months passed. February came. It was cold that year, colder than usual. We got snow, which didn't happen often in Tacoma. I was closing the store one evening when Dale called. "They found her," he said. His voice sounded hollow. "Who?" "Diana Robertson. The girlfriend. She was off a logging road near Mineral." The name of the town hit me immediately. I moved to Lewiston, Idaho in 1995 to teach high school English. I'd never heard of the town before I applied for the job. It's right on the border with Washington, tucked into the valley where 2 rivers meet. Small enough that everyone knows everyone, but big enough that you can disappear into your routine if you want to. I liked it immediately. The people were friendly. The cost of living was reasonable. The school was good. It wasn't until my second year there that I learned about what happened in the 80s. She opened one of the binders and showed me newspaper clippings. Photos of Christina and Brandy. Articles about the search. A grainy picture of Stephen. "There was a man," she said quietly. "Lance Voss. He worked at the theater. He lived between Christina White's house and her friend's house. Christina White, another victim. She disappeared in 1979. She was 12. She was riding her bike home from a friend's house during a parade in Ossiton. Never made it." I felt something cold in my chest. "Same person? That's what the detective thinks. Jackie Nichols. She's with the Ossiton County Sheriff's Office. She's been working these cases for years. She thinks Voss is connected to all of them. Why wasn't he arrested?" Gloria's jaw tightened. "Not enough evidence. He's dead now. Died in the 2010s. Never confessed. Never charged." She closed the binder. "But I know he did it. And so does Detective Nichols. We just can't prove it." I didn't know what to say. "There's another victim too," Gloria said. Kristen David. She disappeared in 1981, riding her bike from Moscow to Lewiston. They found her remains in the Snake River, dismembered, wrapped in newspaper. I felt sick. 5 people, Gloria said, all in a few years, all in this valley, and nobody was ever arrested. I thanked her for talking to me and left the library. I sat in my car for a long time, trying to process what I'd heard. Over the next few weeks, I couldn't stop thinking about it. I started doing my own research. I'd go to the library during my prep period and read through old newspapers on microfiche. The details were worse than I'd imagined. Christina White disappeared in broad daylight during a county fair. She was sick from heat stroke and called her mom to come get her, but her mom didn't have a car. So Christina got on her bike to ride home. It was just a few blocks. She never arrived. Weeks later, some of her schoolwork was found scattered in a field. Nothing else, no bike, no body, no trace. Kristen David was an experienced cyclist, 22 years old, about to graduate from college. She was riding south on Highway 95 when she vanished. 8 days later, fishermen found parts of her body in the Snake River, wrapped in plastic bags and newspaper. The FBI put out a bulletin about a man in a brown van who'd been seen approaching female cyclists on Highway 95 that day. He was never identified. And then there was the night in September 1982 when 3 people disappeared at once. I found an article from 1995 that said police believed all 3 were killed inside the Lewiston Civic Theater, that they'd been murdered by another employee, that the bodies were moved afterward. The article didn't name the suspect, but it mentioned he'd moved to the East Coast in the late 90s, Lance Voss. I started having dreams about it, not nightmares exactly, just dreams where I was walking through the theater building I'd never actually been inside looking for something. The dreams always ended the same way. I'd open a door, and there'd be nothing behind it, just darkness. One night in November, I went to a community theater production. Not the Civic Theater, a different one. But sitting in the audience watching the play, I kept thinking about Christina and Brandy and Steven. About how they'd been involved in theater because they loved it. About how it was supposed to be a safe space, a creative outlet. About how someone had used that trust to kill them. After the play, I walked to my car. It was late, maybe 10:30. The parking lot was mostly empty. I noticed someone standing near the back of the lot smoking a cigarette. An older man, maybe in his 60s. He was looking at the theater building. I don't know why, but I walked over. "Good show?" I asked. He glanced at me. "I wouldn't know. I just like the building." "You involved in theater?" "Used to be, long time ago." He took a drag from his cigarette. "You're not from here originally, are you?" he said. "No. I moved here a couple years ago. Teaching." He nodded. "Word of advice. Don't go asking too many questions about the old days." I felt a chill. "What do you mean?" "I mean people here have long memories, and some things are better left alone." He dropped the cigarette and crushed it under his boot. "Enjoy the show," he said, and walked to his truck. I stood there for a long time after he left. I didn't go back to the library after that. I didn't ask any more questions. I told myself I was being paranoid. That the guy was just some old man with nothing better to do than be cryptic. But I couldn't shake the feeling that I'd been warned. In 1998, I heard that police had interviewed someone named Robert Lee Yates as part of an investigation. Yates was a serial killer who'd murdered at least 13 women in the Spokane area. My name's David. I'm retired now, living in Boise. But I still think about Lewiston sometimes. About the conversations I overheard. About the woman I met at the library who told me things she probably shouldn't have. It started during a faculty meeting in September of 1996. We were discussing safety protocols, standard stuff, lock doors after hours, walk to your car in groups if it's dark, that kind of thing. One of the older teachers, a woman named Patricia who'd been at the school since the 70s, raised her hand. During the investigation, they interviewed Lance Voss as a person of interest. Nothing came of it. Voss was never charged with anything. I left Lewiston in 2000, took a job in Boise. I told myself it was for better pay, better opportunities, but the truth is I wanted to leave. The town felt heavy to me, like it was carrying something it couldn't put down. I kept in touch with Patricia for a while. She'd send me Christmas cards, updates about former students. In one of her cards, she mentioned that Gloria was still working on the case. Still trying to get someone to listen. She'll never stop, Patricia wrote. I don't think she can. I thought about that a lot, about what it would be like to lose someone and never get answers. To know that the person who did it lived their life freely, never facing consequences. In 2017, I read that a cold case unit had been formed specifically to review these murders. I felt a brief surge of hope, but nothing came of it. No arrests, no new leads. Lance Voss died sometime in the 2010s. The articles didn't give an exact date, just that he passed away on the East Coast, far from Idaho. I thought about him sometimes. About whether he ever felt guilt, whether he ever came close to confessing, or whether he just lived his life, ordinary and unremarkable, secure in the knowledge that he'd gotten away with it. Last year, I was visiting Lewiston for a high school reunion. I hadn't been back in over 20 years. The town looked mostly the same, a little older, a little smaller, like a lot of rural towns. I drove past the Civic Theater. It's still standing, still operational. I thought about Christina and Brandy and Stephen, about how they walked into that building one night and never walked out, about how Christina White got on her bike in broad daylight and vanished, about how Kristen David was cycling through the countryside and disappeared without a trace. 5 people, 1 valley, no arrests. I thought about Detective Nichols still working the cases, about Gloria still advocating for her cousin, about all the people who remember and refuse to let it be forgotten. I didn't stop at the theater. I just drove past and kept going. But that night, back in my hotel room, I looked up the cases online. There were forums dedicated to them. Podcasts, a documentary, people still cared, people still wanted answers, and I realized something that bothered me more than anything else. Whoever did this, whether it was Lance Voss or someone else, they didn't just take 5 lives. They took the peace of an entire community. Because everyone who lived here in the 80s, everyone who knew those victims or knew someone who knew them, they all carry it. They all remember, and they all know that someone got away with it. I drove back to Boise the next morning. I haven't been back to Lewiston since, but sometimes I think about that man in the parking lot, the one who told me not to ask questions. And I wonder if he was just being paranoid, or if he knew something I didn't. Are we going to talk about the theater? She asked. The principal looked uncomfortable. That's not relevant anymore, Patricia. It's relevant to new faculty who don't know the history. He sighed. Fine. Briefly, Patricia turned to look at those of us who were newer. In 1982, 3 people disappeared from the Lewiston Civic Theater. 2 young women and a man. They were all connected to the theater. They found the women's bodies 2 years later. The man was never found. She said it simply, without drama, but I felt the room shift. A few of the veteran teachers looked down at their desks. Do they know what happened? Someone asked. No, Patricia said, but there was a suspect. He worked at the theater. He was never charged. The principal cleared his throat. The point is, we need to be aware of our surroundings. That's all. The meeting moved on, but I couldn't stop thinking about it. After, I asked Patricia if she knew the people who disappeared. I knew one of them, she said. Christina Nelson. She was a student here before she went to college. Sweet girl, very involved in theater. What do you think happened? She looked at me for a long moment. I think someone who worked with them killed them, and I think that person is probably still alive. I started asking around after that, carefully. I didn't want to seem morbid, but I was curious. Most people didn't want to talk about it. A few would give me the basic facts. 3 people vanished on the same night, September 12, 1982. Christina Nelson and her stepsister Brandy Miller left Christina's apartment to walk to a grocery store and never came back. Stephen Pearsall went to the theater to do laundry and practice his clarinet. Also never came back. The prevailing theory was that all 3 had been at the theater that night and someone killed them there, but nobody wanted to say the suspect's name out loud. I didn't understand why until I met Gloria. It was October, I'd gone to the public library to do some research for a lesson plan. I was in the local history section when I noticed a woman sitting at a table nearby, surrounded by binders and photocopied newspaper articles. She caught me looking. "You interested in local history?" she asked. I said I was new to town and trying to learn more about the area. She smiled, but it didn't reach her eyes. "Then you should know about the murders." She introduced herself as Gloria Booperts. Christina Nelson had been her cousin. "I've been working on this for years," she said, gesturing to the binders. "Trying to get someone to pay attention. Trying to get justice for Christina and Brandy and Stephen." I sat down. She told me everything. About how the three of them disappeared on the same night. About how the police initially thought they'd run away, maybe joined a cult. About how 2 years passed before hunters found Christina and Brandy's remains off Highway 95 near Kendrick. About how Stephen was still missing. "They were thrown off the side of the road," Gloria said. Her voice was steady, but her hands were shaking slightly, like garbage. "And the police didn't do anything for 2 years. Why not? Because they didn't take it seriously at first. And by the time they did, evidence was gone. Memories had faded. The trail was cold." My grandfather told me a story when I was 16 that I didn't believe. We were sitting on his porch in Kelso, Washington, watching the sun go down over the valley. He'd been quiet all afternoon, which wasn't unusual. He was the kind of man who only spoke when he had something worth saying. Then, out of nowhere, he said, "I met one of them once." I asked him what he meant. "One of the miners. From Ape Canyon. Fred Beck. Hearing something moving above you." I felt uneasy suddenly. Not scared. Just aware of how isolated I was. How quiet everything had become. I started back toward the trailhead. That night, back at my hotel, I looked up the 1924 incident online. I found more details than my grandfather had mentioned. The miners' names were Fred Beck, Marion Smith, Roy Smith, Gabe Lefevre, and John Peterson. They'd been working a claim called the Vanderwhite Mine for 6 years. According to Beck's account, they'd been hearing strange sounds for weeks before the attack. Loud thumping, like something hitting its chest. Whistling that seemed to come from multiple directions. They'd found massive footprints near springs and creek beds. One miner referred to in the accounts as Hank, though his real name was probably Marion Smith, was particularly spooked. He was an experienced outdoorsman and said the tracks didn't match any animal he knew. The day of the attack, Beck and Hank went to get water from a spring. They saw the creature standing beside a pine tree about 100 yards away. Hank fired 3 times. Beck said he could see bark flying off the tree from the shots. The creature disappeared, then reappeared further down the canyon running upright. Beck fired 3 more shots before it vanished. That night, the attack began around midnight. Something started hurling rocks at the cabin. The impacts were so violent that chinking the material between the logs fell loose from the walls. Beck described seeing 3 figures through the gaps. He said they were covered in blackish-brown hair and stood together like they were coordinating. The siege lasted all night. Something climbed on the roof. Something reached through a gap and tried to grab an axe. The miners fired through the openings in the walls whenever they saw movement. The attacks would stop briefly, then resume. By morning, the creatures were gone. The miners found rocks scattered around the cabin, some weighing more than 50 pounds. Deep footprints surrounded the building. They left immediately, walked straight down to Kelso and told people what happened. The story hit the newspapers. Search parties went up to investigate. They found the cabin. They found rocks. They found some large tracks, but no bodies, no creatures, nothing conclusive. A local game warden declared the whole thing was nonsense. Some people theorized it was teenagers from a YMCA camp at Spirit Lake throwing rocks down the canyon. But that theory had problems. The cabin wasn't at the bottom of the canyon. It was on a slope below Pummy Butte. The rocks couldn't have just rolled down. They had to be thrown with considerable force. And the teenagers' theory didn't explain the creature Beck and Hank shot at earlier that day. or the arm reaching into the cabin, or the footprints. I kept reading. In 1967, Beck published a book about the incident. By then, Bigfoot had become a cultural phenomenon after the Patterson-Gimlin film. Beck's book got attention, but it also got dismissed as cashing in on the craze. What struck me, though, was that Beck had been telling the same story since 1924. Consistently, he never changed the details or embellished, and the other miners, Marion Smith in particular, refused to talk about it afterward. Marion's son said his father was spooked for the rest of his life and wouldn't discuss what happened. That bothered me more than anything. If it was a hoax, why would Marion Smith, a man who'd worked the mine successfully for 6 years, never go back? Why would he stay silent about it? Why would 5 men abandon a profitable gold claim and never return? I started looking into whether the cabin site had ever been found. Most sources said the location had been lost to history. The 1980 eruption had dramatically changed the landscape, and people assumed the site was buried under ash and debris. But in 2013, I found an article about a researcher named Mark Mersel, who claimed to have found the cabin site. Mersel had been fascinated by the story since childhood. Using old photographs, Forest Service records, and his surveying skills, he led a team on a difficult off-trail hike to find the location. They found old-growth stumps that matched the historical photos. They found remnants of the cabin. And they found spent rifle cartridges, the kind that would have been used in 1924. The cabin was real. I looked at the photos from Mersel's expedition. The site was remote, dense forest, steep terrain, the kind of place where you'd feel very alone. That weekend, I drove back up to Mount St. Helens. I wanted to hike Ape Canyon again, now that I knew more. It was late October. The weather was cold and overcast. I parked and started down the trail. There were a few other people at the trailhead, but they headed in different directions. About halfway down the canyon, I stopped at the same spot as before. I stood there listening. The wind moved through the trees above the canyon walls. It made a sound like whistling. I thought about the miners hearing that sound at night, not knowing what it was. This was in the 50s, long after it happened. He came through town and gave a talk at the library. Maybe 20 people showed up. I'd heard of Ape Canyon. Everyone in the area had. It was a hiking spot on Mount St. Helens, named after some old story about 8 men attacking miners in the 20s. Tourist stuff. My grandfather shook his head when I said that. It wasn't a story. Fred Beck was a real person. I shook his hand, trying to convince themselves it was just wind. I thought about Fred Beck standing in a library in Kelso 30 years after the attack, trying to explain to a small crowd what he'd experienced, knowing most of them wouldn't believe him. I thought about Marion Smith, who never wanted to talk about it again. And I thought about the fact that 5 grown men, experienced outdoorsmen who'd worked that mine for 6 years, left everything behind after one night and never returned. That's what I couldn't get past. Not the rocks, not the footprints, not even the creatures Beck claimed to have seen. It was the fear. The kind of fear that makes you abandon something valuable. The kind that stays with you for decades. I started back up the trail. Near the top, I passed another hiker coming down. He was maybe 60, carrying a large backpack. "How's the trail?" he asked. "Fine, quiet." He nodded. "That's how I like it. Haven't been down here in years. Used to camp in this area back in the 70s. "Ever hear about the 1924 story?" I asked. His expression changed slightly. "Yeah, everyone around here knows it." "You think there's anything to it?" He was quiet for a moment. "I think there are things in these mountains we don't understand. Whether you call them Bigfoot or Sasquatch or whatever." He shrugged. "I've seen things I can't explain. Tracks that don't match anything in the books. Heard sounds that don't make sense. Like what? Like something large moving through the trees. Deliberately. Not like a bear or an elk. Something that knows you're there and doesn't care." He adjusted his pack. "You spend enough time out here alone, you start to understand why people don't talk about it, because it sounds crazy, but it's real." He continued down the trail. I stood there for a while, then walked back to my car. I haven't been back to Ape Canyon since. Not because I'm scared, but because I realized something standing in that canyon. Fred, Beck, and the other miners didn't need me to believe them. They knew what they experienced. They lived with it for the rest of their lives. And whatever it was, whether it was creatures or something else entirely, it was real enough to drive 5 men out of those mountains and keep them out. That's the part that matters, not whether Bigfoot exists, not whether the story can be proven, but whether something happened that night in July 1924 that was so terrifying, so far outside normal experience, that it changed those men permanently. I think it did, and I think the canyon remembers. And when he talked about what happened up there, he wasn't trying to sell anything. He was just trying to make sense of it. He went quiet for a while. You could tell it still bothered him 30 years later, and he still couldn't explain it. I asked what Beck had said. My grandfather told me the whole thing, about how Beck and 4 other men had been mining gold up on Mount St. Helens in the summer of 1924. About how they'd found footprints, huge ones, 19 inches long around their camp. About how they heard strange sounds at night, whistling, thumping. About how one afternoon, Beck and another miner shot at something they saw near the canyon. Something that looked like a man covered in dark hair, standing upright watching them from behind a tree. And about how that night, something attacked their cabin. He said they threw rocks at the cabin all night, my grandfather said. Big rocks, heavy enough to shake the walls. He said something climbed on the roof and tried to get in. Said they fired their rifles through gaps in the logs until they ran out of ammunition. Did they see what it was? Beck said he saw them through the gaps. 3 of them standing together in the moonlight, covered in hair, maybe 7 feet tall. I must have looked skeptical because my grandfather smiled. That's what I thought too when I was your age. But then he said something that stayed with me. What? He said the next morning when they came out, there were rocks everywhere, some too heavy for one man to lift, and footprints, deep ones, all around the cabin. My grandfather leaned back in his chair. He said they left everything. The mine, the equipment, all of it. They walked down the mountain that morning and never went back. I asked if he believed Beck. He thought about it for a long time. I believe he experienced something. Whether it was what he thought it was, he shrugged. I don't know, but it was real enough that he and 4 other grown men abandoned a gold mine that was paying out. That tells you something. I didn't think about the story much after that. It was interesting, but it felt like something from another time. A weird historical footnote. Then, in 2004, I moved to Portland for work. I was in my 30s by then. My grandfather had passed away a few years earlier. One weekend, I decided to drive up to Mount St. Helens. I'd never been, and I wanted to see the crater from the 1980 eruption. On the way, I saw a sign for Ape Canyon Trail. I remembered my grandfather's story. On impulse, I pulled over. The trailhead was small, just a gravel parking lot and a weathered sign explaining the trail. There was a brief mention of the 1924 incident written in a way that made it sound like a legend, folksy, harmless. I started hiking. The trail followed a narrow canyon with steep rocky walls on both sides. It was beautiful in a stark way, but there was something about it that felt claustrophobic. The canyon walls seemed to close in as I walked deeper. About a mile in, I stopped to rest. It was late afternoon and the light was starting to change. Long shadows stretched across the rocks. I looked up at the canyon walls and tried to imagine what it would have been like to be down here at night. In 1924, with no flashlight, I didn't think much of it the first time. It was the 3rd time it happened that made me stop pretending it was normal. The seatbelt sign had been on longer than usual, and I remember checking my watch because my wrist had started to ache from how tense my arm was. It was just after 4 in the afternoon, still light out, the kind of dull gray daylight that made everything inside the cabin look flatter than it should have. The cabin lights dimmed slightly, the engines changed pitch. The man didn't react. I did. My knee bounced, my fingers curled into the armrest. I told myself to calm down. That was when I noticed his briefcase was open, just a crack, enough to see the edge of something metallic inside. I didn't know what it was. I didn't want to know. I told myself it was a laptop hinge, a clasp, anything. I looked away. When I looked back, the briefcase was closed. He smiled again. That was the first time I felt unsettled, not scared, unsettled. Like I had missed a step on a staircase and caught myself just in time. When we landed, I stood up immediately. I didn't want to be near him. I didn't want to watch him walk off the plane again. As I moved into the aisle, I heard his voice for the first time. "Careful," he said softly. I had nearly bumped into the seat in front of me. I nodded without looking at him and hurried off the plane. For weeks after that, I avoided flying if I could help it. Took trains, drove, made excuses at work. When I couldn't avoid it, I changed flight times. Different days, different airlines. I didn't see him. I started to relax. Then, in early November, my manager told me I had to attend a last-minute meeting in Portland. No alternatives, no rescheduling. I booked the earliest return flight I could find. Different airline, different terminal. I told myself that if I saw him again, I'd say something. Ask him if he traveled this route often. Laugh it off. I boarded the plane. The seat across the aisle was empty. I felt stupid for the rush of relief that went through me. The flight took off on time. I settled in. Put my headphones on, closed my eyes. I must have dozed off. When I opened them, the seatbelt sign was on and the cabin was darker. Outside the window, there was nothing but black. I checked my watch. 5:03. I turned my head. He was there. Same tie, same seat. I don't know when he boarded. My mouth went dry. He was already holding the napkin, folding it, unfolding it. I didn't look away this time. I watched him until he noticed. He met my eyes calmly. No surprise, no recognition. "Do you know where we are?" he asked. His voice was even, almost polite. I swallowed. "Somewhere over Washington," he nodded. "That's what they always say." "Who?" I asked before I could stop myself. He smiled just a little wider this time. "The pilots." I didn't respond. He leaned back in his seat, eyes forward. The conversation was over. The rest of the flight passed in silence. No bourbon this time. No bourbon this time his lap. His hands were empty. When the plane began its descent, I felt my heart start to race. I watched him from the corner of my eye. At some point, he reached down and tugged gently at something near his seat. I heard a sound I didn't recognize. A hollow thump, like a door being tested. The engines roared louder. The cabin tilted. I looked back, fully heart pounding. The rear of the plane was different. Not open. Not exactly. Just wrong. I blinked. It looked normal again. I squeezed my eyes shut, counted to 3, opened them. Everything was fine. When we landed, nothing happened. No alarms, no shouting, no sudden chaos. People stood, collected their bags, complained about the delay. The man stayed seated. As I passed him, he looked up at me. "Third time's usually when people notice," he said. I froze. "What?" I asked. He glanced toward the back of the plane. "You should stop flying." I didn't respond. I couldn't. When I reached the terminal, my legs felt unsteady. I sat on a bench near baggage claim and waited until my breathing slowed. I didn't see him leave the plane. I didn't sleep that night. I tried to rationalize it. Stress, fatigue, a coincidence stretched too thin by anxiety. I replayed every moment, every detail, trying to find where I had imagined something. I told myself I wouldn't fly again. 2 weeks later, my mother had a stroke. I booked the first flight I could. I didn't check the seat number. I didn't look at the aisle when I boarded. I knew. He was already there. This time he spoke before I sat down. "You're late," he said. I had no choice, I replied, surprising myself. He nodded, Nobody ever does. The flight was rough. Wind. Turbulence. The cabin shook enough that people gasped. The seatbelt sign stayed on. He didn't touch the napkin. Instead, he opened the briefcase fully. Inside, there was no laptop, no papers, just straps. Metal. A folded length of fabric I recognized without understanding how. A parachute. I stared. He closed the case. We were somewhere over Washington, I think. I wasn't paying close attention yet. The man across the aisle kept folding and unfolding a cocktail napkin. He wasn't nervous. If anything, he looked bored. He did it slowly, carefully, like he had nothing else to occupy his hands. I noticed him because of the tie. It wasn't flashy or unusual, just black, thin, slightly worn at the edge. What caught my attention was how it didn't match the rest of him. "They don't make planes like this anymore," he said. "Too safe." "What do you want?" I asked. He looked at me for a long time, to know if you're paying attention. The turbulence worsened. The plane dipped. Someone cried out. He reached down. This time, the sound didn't fade. The hollow thump became a groan. A shift. Cold air brushed my ankles. I looked back. The rear of the plane was open. Not wide. Just enough. No one else seemed to notice. The flight attendants were strapped in. The passengers stared forward, white-knuckled, eyes wide. He stood. The wind roared. He slipped on the parachute with practiced ease. Before stepping away, he turned to me. "You see it now," he said. "That's the problem." Then he was gone. The opening sealed. The noise stopped. The plane steadied. No one screamed. No one said a word. When we landed, there were no sirens, no police, no questions. I tried to tell someone, anyone. They looked at me like I was exhausted, like I needed rest. The flight record showed nothing unusual. No door opened, no pressure loss, no missing passenger. I stopped flying. Years have passed. I still check my watch at 4:15. Sometimes when a room gets very quiet, I hear the sound of a napkin folding, unfolding. And I wonder how many times it takes before someone else notices. The suit was too nice, tailored. The shoes were polished. The tie looked like it had been worn for years. I remember thinking he probably flew a lot. That was it. That was the entire thought. Nothing ominous, nothing strange. At least not yet. I was flying home from Portland to Seattle on a work trip that had run longer than expected. The company paid for economy, so I was back near the rear of the plane, close enough to hear the galley when the flight attendants talked. I liked that spot. It felt less claustrophobic somehow. The flight itself was quiet. No turbulence worth mentioning. A few kids up front, a couple in business attire behind me. Ordinary. The man with the tie ordered a bourbon. No ice. When the flight attendant walked away, he looked out the window and smiled to himself. Not a grin. Just a small movement at the corner of his mouth. I looked away. The first time, that was all it was. A stranger on a plane. A detail I would have forgotten before landing. But I didn't forget, because 2 weeks later, he was there again. Same tie, same seat across the aisle. This time, I noticed the napkin right away. I told myself it was coincidence. Seattle and Portland aren't exactly far apart. People commute. People travel for work. I did it myself. There was no reason to assume anything else. Still, I watched him more closely. He boarded early, paid attention to where he was sitting, nodded politely to the woman next to him. No bag under the seat, nothing in the overhead bin. Just a slim briefcase that never left his lap. When the plane leveled out, he ordered another bourbon. No ice. I remember the way the cabin sounded then. The hum of the engines. The soft rustle of magazines. Someone coughing a few rows up. All the background noise you don't notice until later when you replay it in your head. I checked my watch again. Habit. 4:27. The man unfolded the napkin, folded it again. I tried to read, but my eyes kept drifting back to him. There was something about the way he sat. too relaxed, like he wasn't on a schedule. When we landed, I expected him to stand up quickly, like everyone else. He didn't. He waited, let people pass, took his time. I lost sight of him in the terminal. That should have been the end of it. It wasn't. The third time was a month later, on a rainy Thursday evening. I remember because my flight had been delayed and the terminal smelled like wet coats and burnt coffee. I was tired, irritable. I wanted to get home. When I stepped onto the plane, I knew before I saw him. It was the tie. Black, slightly frayed at the edge, same seat. This time my stomach tightened. Not fear. Not yet. Just the unpleasant awareness that something had repeated itself one too many times. He noticed me looking. Our eyes met for half a second. He looked away first. I sat down and told myself to stop being ridiculous. People take the same flights all the time. Same days, same times, same seats. That was all this was. I checked my watch. 4:15. He ordered the bourbon. No ice. I don't know why that detail stuck with me so much. Maybe because everything else about him felt interchangeable. The drink was consistent. Halfway through the flight, the turbulence picked up. Not severe, but enough that the captain turned the seatbelt sign back on.